Hi, thanks for joining. In the last video, we had just arrived in Bizerte, Tunisia, after completing a night crossing from Cagliari in Sardinia. Now, there are several reasons why we wanted to go sailing in Tunisia. It's obviously a very beautiful country, but also a very unique one, and I've always loved the off-the-beaten-path travel destinations. It also has a super rich history, but I guess most importantly, or at least the catalyst for wanting to go, came down to the Schengen visa days that we had to watch out for. I'm Australian and Abril is from Argentina, which means that we can only spend 90 days in a 180-day period inside the European Schengen zones. And once we got to Sardinia, we weren't really low on days, but we started to realize that they were slowly ticking down, and we also needed to do some boat works. And we didn't particularly want to be burning through our Schengen days, sitting in a marina somewhere, trying to, do some work on the boat. So it seemed like a no-brainer to head somewhere where we could escape the Schengen zone and also do some decent boat work. And once we looked into it and researched, we found that Tunisia is actually quite well set up in some areas to receive cruisers and do some boat works without having to worry about those Schengen days. Not only that, it was literally only a 20-hour sail from Cagliari to the coast of the north coast of Tunisia. So yeah, we made the decision to head there and not only get the boat works done, but check out everything that Tunisia had to offer. And my parents were certainly up for it as well because they had never been to Tunisia. Now quarantine because we're dirty and infected. We chose Bizerte because it was the closest port of entry from Cagliari in Sardinia, but also because it was a place in the west that we probably wouldn't get to if we went straight to Hamammet, where we were planning to stay a bit longer. The entire check-in process was rigorous. We had to go to customs, the border police, the Coastguard, and to the captainary of the marina. But in all, it only took about an hour, which is much shorter than we had heard some horror stories taking. While we arrived at about 10 o'clock in the morning, we spent much of the day tidying up the boat and doing a few odd jobs before heading out to explore Bizerte. Bizerte is actually the northernmost city in Africa, and while it's a small city, it's a really bustling one. Although the city centre has no high-rise buildings, it is still really busy with lots of shops, markets, cafes, and this view to Port de Bizerte, which is a really nice canal area that is surrounded by restaurants and cafes. The next morning we passed through the viewport area again, this time to cross over to the Medina of Bizerte, which is the old fort city. It's full of really old houses connected by tiny little alleyways with lots of palm trees and flowers growing in between. It was really beautiful. We went to check out of Bizerte Marina just before 12 o'clock, and this would be our first experience trying to simply exit a marina and go to another marina within Tunisia. We had to go through the exact same processes, although not as detailed as we had to for arriving and leaving. That means visiting the immigration police, visiting the Coastguard, visiting the customs office, and also visiting the captainary, or head of the marina. So this took longer than we expected. We simply expected to pay the marina bill and get out of there. But we eventually left and took note about how long it would take to get in and out of various marinas. But before too long we were underway, and we had to motor just to the first cape, just because the wind was directly on us. But once we rounded the first cape, we could sail most of the way. There were some really interesting sights along the Tunisian coast, including these hills which are shaped exactly like pyramids. And not too far away from the Pyramid Hills was the Île Pilau, which is a really interesting rock formation island just off the coast. It was proving to be a really lovely day's sail, with good wind but relatively calm seas and nice scenery along the way. That was all to change, however, after we rounded Cape Taff. After we rounded Cape Taff, the weather was a little bit more rough, with stronger winds and definitely rougher seas. This first passage within Tunisia turned out to be another very good Tunisian sailing learning experience. We had planned to stop in at the little fishing port called Gar al-Mel. The reason being is that there's so many kind of fishing pots and nets just off the coast of Tunisia, and we didn't particularly want to be sailing close to the mainland in the night. So we resolved to do, I think, about 6 or 7 hours of sailing to Gar al-Mel, spend the night before doing the easy 2 or 3 hours to Gammarth Marina in Tunis the next day. Now, granted that the pilot book I was using was relatively outdated. It was from, like, I guess the late 1990s, 2000s. But the pilot book did say it was a great spot to spend a night. You simply needed to radio in, pull up beside one of the fishing boats in the port, and pay a small fee for staying the night before leaving the next day. Well, it was about sunset when we came into the port. No one was answering the VHF. Once we got well and truly within the port, it was dark. Not only was it dark, there was no lighting around. We're having a really hard time trying to find anyone within the port to talk to, anyone who could even help us with some directions. All the time we were continually calling on the VHF, and also watching the depth sounder, because as is the case in a lot of Tunisian ports, there wasn't much room beneath the keel. I think we must have spent a good 20 minutes, half an hour just bobbing around in the small fishing port trying to get a hold of someone before we realized it was just simply not going to happen. Therefore, we made the decision to cross I guess it's the Bay of Tunis, to get to Gammarth Marina, but this is about 9 or 10 o'clock, or about 9 o'clock at night. This is a relatively simple sail, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fishing pots and buoys and strange areas very close to the Tunisian coast that we didn't want to have to deal with at night. And sure enough, we came very close to picking up one of these fishing cages, these fishing traps. Luckily enough, Gammarth Marina is a bigger port that actually caters to some cruisers, so there was someone on watch that we could contact to get in, and we were able to pull up to the refueling station before moving to a proper berth the next day. Having said that, it was still a little bit sketchy coming to the port. I think, as is the case with a lot of Tunisian ports, they silt up very quickly and they don't get dredged very often. So it was a little bit nerve-wracking coming into the port of Gammarth at about 11:30 at night with barely anything under the keel. It worked out really well though, and we had a very late dinner and a nice, safe night in Gammarth Marina. One of the things I most wanted to see in Tunisia was the ancient archaeological site of Carthage, which was originally a Phoenician site turned to a Roman site. There are actually several different archaeological sites around the area, with housing residential areas in between. The first one we checked out were the Roman baths, which is the most expansive and probably the most impressive. It was really massive, and it was really amazing that we could just walk around freely and check out all the different nooks and crannies of this ancient archaeological site. It was really nice that it was actually really down by the seaside as well, so we got a sense of where the Romans would have sailed across and come to establish these baths. We were loving the site, but it was also getting hot by this part of the morning. So what is the cooling system they had in this ancient Roman baths of Carthage?
I think it's one of this.
USB chargeable, of course. Thermal charging. Not too far away from the baths up the hill were the Roman villas, so we checked that out afterwards before heading to Sidi Bou Said, which is the traditional Tunisian village up on the hill near the seaside. This is the site of the famous blue and white villas with lots of beautiful, I think, bougainvillea flowers growing in between. It's an incredibly beautiful spot to walk around and get a bit of a snack in, but at the same time it is quite touristy. Nonetheless, definitely a must-see if you're visiting. Towards the end of the area, we got a really nice view of the Mediterranean Sea and the Sidi Bou Said marina, which actually was one of the top places we wanted to stay, but apparently the entry to the marina had silted up so that it was a little bit difficult to get in and out. Besides that, they didn't respond to my emails or calls, so we stayed somewhere else. After walking around so much, we really felt like sitting down and enjoying some Tunisian almond tea. So we found a place in Sidi Bou Said, but tourists beware. Here they tried to scam us literally by insisting that the price on the menu was in US dollars and not Tunisian dinars. We refused to pay that, of course, and got out of there pretty quickly. On the way to Sidi Bou Said, the cab driver had pointed out the Palais du Baron de Langer and suggested we go visit, and I'm really glad that we did because it was an incredible experience. The sheer opulence and over-the-top design of this palace, which was essentially a summer home, was absolutely incredible, and we could walk around the entire grounds and check out many of the rooms which were set up very much as they were when the place was occupied by the Baron. It has so much detail, including a fountain that flows through the welcoming hall, tons of marble, ornate woodwork, and rooms filled with beautiful musical instruments and period furniture. The palace also has a performance space in the courtyard, which looks like an incredible place to see a concert. It has its own hammam or bathhouse, and we just love the ornate woodwork in nearly every single room here. Money from slavery. In a section of the palace, it actually set up a musical instrument museum, which was really fascinating, especially being a musician, to see all the unique Arab or Tunisian musical instruments side by side with a lot of Western classical instruments. I was really fascinated by these instruments that looked like they were made out of the skin of a goat, a kind of Arabic bagpipe. On the way back to the marina, we explored the Gammarth area, which is close to the marina, but by this point we were quite exhausted and needed to go take a break. The next morning we were off again exploring the Medina of Tunis. It was only about a 35-40 minute drive into the center of Tunis, and we had a guide show us around the center there. It was a Sunday, which was a bit disappointing, so many of the souks and markets were closed, but we still had to walk around the narrow alleyways and checked out some of the old palatial homes which had been converted into stores, including this one that had a magnificent view over the rooftops of Tunis.
All this the Medina, and this is the minaret from the big mosque.
Yeah.
In old mosque, Arabic Muslim, the minaret square. One time we've been here, the king.
In amongst the narrow alleyways and winding tunnels was a really cute traditional Arabic tea house. Our guide also showed us a traditional Quranic school, and this is the courtyard of that, before checking out the main mosque of the Medina of Tunis. With most of the shops and souks being closed, we decided to leave the Medina and head straight for one of the more busier downtown areas with the gate that is at Bab al Bar. This is another very old and busy area, but with most of the shops here still open, we thought we were better off walking around this area. The opulence of the old colonial buildings was incredible, and this is the old British embassy that has since been converted into a hotel. Bril and I actually really wanted some Tunisian carpets for Argo, so we started to look around, but being a bit overwhelmed, we resolved to return when we had a bit more time. We got some lunch and had a walk around the main avenue in downtown Tunis before heading back to Argo. Being the last night that my parents were on board before heading back to Australia, we thought we'd go out for a nice traditional Tunisian meal. Little did we know that this would likely be the cause of my dad's serious salmonella poisoning when he returned to Australia. At least the location was nice. We were all up before dawn the next morning. My parents had an early flight to Athens before flying on to Australia, and April and I had to start our journey eastward because it would take about 2 full days of sailing to get to Hamammet. We said our goodbyes, and after Abdul and myself did all the necessary checkouts with all the authorities, we were leaving the marina, taking care at the marina entrance because it was still quite silted up and not much room underneath the keel. At first, at least around the Bay of Tunis, there was very little wind and a very flat sea state, which was nice for the comfort, but there wasn't really any sailing to be done. So our broad plan was to get to Port Yasmine Hamammet. Now, to get to Port Yasmine Hamammet from Gammarth would be a pretty simple overnight sail. As I kind of mentioned earlier though, it is not a great idea to be sailing close to the Tunisian coast at night. There are just so many random buoys, fishing traps and fishing nets. So we resolved to pull in for a stop at another fishing port, that is Port Kelibia. We did, however, learn from our first experience with Tunisian fishing ports and decided to get someone from Gammarth Marina to call ahead to the authorities at Port Kelibia to let them know that we were planning to come and give them an estimate for our arrival time. This would be my suggestion for anyone who's planning to cruise along the coast of Tunisia. Always call ahead and in fact get someone who can speak either Arabic or French to call ahead and make that reservation for you, just so there's no confusion or you're not left hanging around a port at after sunset. And as it quite often is with these kind of things, my parents were always trying to have a look out for a dolphin sighting while on the boat, without any success, and as soon as they leave, our first passage featured a visit by some dolphins. Oh well, they'll have to wait until next time. As we began to round the famous Cap Bon, the wind really started to pick up, which was at first promising, but it ended up being from the completely wrong direction and was pushing about 25-30 knots. As we were approaching Kelibia fishing port, we started to worry that we had got ourselves into a similar situation as the Gar al Nil fishing port, because we were radioing the typical frequencies, and no one was responding. As we were pretty much entering the port, we got a response back, and I'm not sure which authority it was, but they gave us permission to enter the port. And on the entry, it seems some Coastguard vessels pointed towards the direction in the corner of the port where we could moor up. Once in this corner of the port, the Coastguard asked us to moor up alongside the entry of a lift-out bay in the port. Now, this is in no terms a berth, but this is where we were told to moor.
Registration papers or the boat or something.
I was actually really impressed with Abdul and myself for managing to moor alongside the entry of a lift-out bay without scratching or damaging the boat in any way. And a little bit disappointed that we had to pay for this night in this fishing port in a very compromised position. We got through the night without any problems because we had literally loaded up that one side of the boat with all the fenders that we had. In the morning, however, I think it was when I went to finalize all the paperwork with the authorities that somehow one of the fenders got pushed to the side and we ended up scraping alongside the port quay there. Really disappointing, particularly because from the moment we had to moor there, I could tell that this was not a safe spot to moor. Anyway, it was really interesting to spend the night at this little fishing port amongst all the other fishing vessels and the locals who were fishing down in the port. But yet another boat repair to do. A lot of these issues we thought could be solved with just being able to anchor somewhere. And the rules of the law regarding anchoring Tunisia are still a bit vague or still a bit grey. We've read a lot of forums where people have said that they've anchored, and to be honest, if you need to spend one night somewhere simply for safety, it seems you can easily anchor somewhere. However, the Coastguard really don't like you doing so. Once we were there a few weeks and spoke in greater detail to some locals, we figured out the reasons for the such strict regulations on anchoring and the strict regulations in terms of registering with all the authorities when you leave a marina, and furthermore, when you're at sea sailing between destinations in Tunisia, because they will call you at least once a day on the VHF and ask you a series of questions about what your position is, where you're going, and how many people you have on the boat. The reason for this is that the Tunisian government regularly comes under pressure to put a cap or get greater control over their waters because of the immigration crisis of sub-Saharan Africans using people smugglers to get to Europe. For those who aren't familiar, there's a major crisis, particularly in certain times of the year, where really desperate people, for whatever reason, flee their country and pay people smugglers an absurd amount of money to cross from North Africa into European waters and claim asylum. And they do so in incredibly unseaworthy boats. I mean, we're talking about literal ribs that they're crossing the Mediterranean Sea in whatever conditions. And I think the Tunisian government has come under a lot of pressure, both from European governments and human rights groups, to put a greater watch on this situation. So that being said, it makes sense why they would want to constantly check in on you and wondering what you're doing, because I guess any boat out there could be someone who's illegally smuggling desperate people into Europe. The passage from Kelibia fishing port to Port Yasmine Hamammet was going to be about 7 hours of sailing. Not too bad, and we actually started off doing some really great sailing. And we're even joined by a pod of dolphins as we were rounding the final headland and heading towards Port Yasmine. We arrived in Port Yasmine Hamammet at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it seems just in time. There was a rather menacing looking weather system coming through, and we managed to dock just before the lightning, wind and rain started. We were really happy, not just because we missed the storm, but because this marina appeared to be the most professionally managed so far. The marinero gave me a lift to do all the formalities at the port office, and then another lift back to Argo. And so we were finally in Port Yasmine Hamammet, where we could pause for a little bit, and we'd planned to stay a couple of weeks at least, so that we could do some boat works, do some organising on the boat. It actually felt like a new kind of start or a new beginning, because this was the first time in several months that Abril and myself had really been alone on the boat to go through things and get settled into our new home. So it felt really refreshing, and it felt like a fresh start. That being said, we needed to get to work straight away to get through the expansive list of things that we needed to complete on the boat before leaving Tunisia. So for that reason, please subscribe to make sure that you can catch our next video where I go through all the boat works that we did in Tunisia before heading off again. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.